Very good. Okay. Okie dokie, we're ready.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are back again on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Did a little restart there. The technology is a little wonky. My camera doesn't seem to be wanting to work with us, but that's fine. We got Dan Winter here on speaker view, so you'll be seeing him for this interview. I'll be hiding over here in the pixelized green corner with my head chopped off into a million colors. But anyways, Dan, it's really a pleasure to have you on the show. I don't want to delay anymore because we have some really deep topics to get into. So without further ado, would you mind giving maybe the folks in the audience who haven't heard of you before a quick brief 101 on what you do and where you come from?
Yeah, a lot of people know me. My name is Dan Winter, fractalfield.com, theimploder.com, flameinmind.com, therify.net. My background, psychophysiology, University of Detroit, systems analyst, IBM. Been teaching the physics of consciousness for 30 years. And now we do the technology of implosion in water, theimploder.com, and in brainwaves for Bliss, flameinmind.com. And now our plasma rejuvenation tech, therify.net, is in use in like 25 countries. And now we've just invented gravity, and we can tell you why objects fall to the ground if you'd like to know. We're into some of the high-tech stuff. It's all based on fractality. That fractality creates implosion electrically, and that's the origin of negentropy and self-organization and life force and all kinds of cool stuff.
Wow, you just hit us with a lot of information. Let's start with gravity, because I think that most people have a sort of Newtonian misnomer about gravity that you, over the past few years, have expanded farther past that idea by leaps and bounds. Am I correct in that?
Yes, well, it's clear Einstein and the leading physicists agree that non-destructive charge collapse is the solution to gravity and the unified field. And at least people like Einstein, NASA, and Stephen Hawking were conscientious enough to be embarrassed that they don't have a clue why objects fall to the ground. But unfortunately, if you don't know why objects fall to the ground, you can't know the origin of life force or negentropy, or the cause of propulsion, or all the good stuff, or even the way through death. It's all about implosive black hole non-destructive compression, literally a fractalfield.com. So once you understand why anything is centripetal, then you can understand why everything is centripetal, like gravity, life force, and literally consciousness itself. Consciousness is a plasma vortex tornado that forms inside your head centripetally. And when your brain waves indicate compression, that's when it happens. That's how kids would see without their eyes. And that's exactly and measurably what you take with you when you lucid dream and when you die, that coherence. So understanding the centripetal force of gravity is step 101 to learning everything I'm talking about.
Now, let's try to simplify this. How can we, for folks sitting at home listening to the audio, visualize centripetal force? Can we think of something like a shape, like maybe a vortex kind of shape, a donut kind of shape? What would you say for that?
Well, I have a bunch of toys and slides handy, but my handy little donut's not out of it. So imagine this is Victor Schauberger's piezoelectrically doped, which means a rock powder, in the water vortex. Now, Schauberger's water vortex is spinning away, and suddenly it spontaneously gets colder, called negentropy. And at that moment, when it spontaneously gets colder, it begins making voltage from gravity. It's literally a zero-point energy device. And then the implosion, that centripetal force of charge, because the water vortex becomes piezo because of the rock powder, then the angle of the centripetal force, the converging momentum at the throat of the vortex, and we even know the idealized angle for the throat of that vortex, 76 degree, the Russian pyramid angle, makes the perfect vortex. So as that charge is coming down the throat of that vortex, if it implodes, it converges at the center at an accurate angle, then that centripetal inertia will drive the charge that's in this at the center, which is normally a transverse electromagnetic field, which is up and down, will drive or implode out the center, what's called a longitudinal electromagnetic, sometimes called scalar. which is a compressional component of the electrical field. And not many people know that Bearden proved by equation that that longitudinal wave, that scalar interferometry, that is the stuff of gravity waves. So literally, that is how fractality, that implosion, pushes out at the center of that pine cone a longitudinal wave, which is actually the physics of propulsion. So that's literally, for example, if that were a mercury vortex doped with iron powder, that's how Vimana, Nazi, Bell, Haunebu flew, and then the Nazi Dark Fleet. And then if you take that into a piezo quartz crystal, that's called warp propulsion as opposed to impulse, and you'd have a phase conjugate pump wave in the sides of that piezo crystal, the dilithium crystals in Star Trek, actually, and that's warp propulsion. So the last two videos on our video channel, a detailed presentation of the physics of Star Trek Future, youtube.com/Dan Winter Fractal Field. So we're deep into that. If you want more detail, we got it. Slides, whatever you like.
I love it. I love it. Yes, folks, please. The links are all in the description. So at any point, if you want to pause and check out some of these videos to sort of brush up on what we're talking about, you do a great job, Dan, of explaining it. And
well, the physics in detail, fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity, and you have the published physics article of how fractality causes gravity. Many physicists already agree that fractality is the cause of gravity. Unfortunately, that never occurred to them to discuss what is a fractal electric field. So I wrote the equation to prove Planck times whole number multiplies the golden ratio, that hydrogen is fractal. So the reason hydrogen makes gravity, it is fractal, and I wrote the equations to prove it. Planck, which is the musical key signature of the universe, times whole number multiples of golden ratio equals hydrogen radii, meaning hydrogen is literally a rose. And that's why and how it makes gravity. Hello, that is the smoking gun.
Right. Wow. So let's parse that out a little bit. Hydrogen is a fractal. Now, when
Absolutely.
you
I was
say
the first one to prove
hydrogen,
it. Yes,
now
sorry.
when you say hydrogen is a rose,
Yeah.
let's build a bridge between those two ideas. How does that make sense for people who are just sort of wrapping their head around that hydrogen is a fractal? How do we then jump to it is a rose? Is the relationship that hydrogen has with these fractals and the fractals it creates sort of a 5-petaled like rose?
Are we going to do pictures here? That could be really fun.
Please, yeah, feel free to share your screen.
Let's see, Star Trek Future. Okay. Okay, so this is the effective geometry of hydrogen. So if you take the center of that pine cone as the Planck length, the musical key signature of every wave that physics had ever measured, and then multiply that by powers of golden ratio, you get the radii of hydrogen. Let's see, here we are. Okay. So these are the radii of hydrogen here on the left. And this is Planck, LP, times whole number exponents of golden ratio, super precisely the radii of hydrogen, meaning hydrogen looks like this. See on the right, R2, R3? That is a rose. That is exactly the reason hydrogen makes gravity. So in that top-down view, golden ratio is enabling the waves of charge to add and multiply recursively, constructively. And that implosion of charge in the center of hydrogen, proving that it's fractal, is also the way in which hydrogen makes gravity. Effectively, in that rose petal geometry. Let's see, we have a lot of pictures of that.
Now, could it also be said that hydrogen, because of this force, the way it acts, creates the sort of blueprint for a rose to look the way it looks, and we're sort of just seeing it in reverse, like microcosm and macrocosm, identifying the sacred geometry of the rose and seeing its larger implications in the sort of subtle realms of our reality?
Well, when I say a rose, what I'm referring to is an electrical metaphor for perfect charge wave fractality. So it is a very precise metaphor that if I animate that geometry, I've got so many pictures here. I have too many pictures here, but if there's a side view of that rose, but if you take the top down view of that rose, which is actually on the right there, see that's the side and top down view, and it basically is 5, 10 spirals of the golden mean, which I proved is the structure of hydrogen, but it's also the structure of every living protein, especially DNA. So that is fractality perfected, for which a rose is the perfect metaphor.
Beautiful. Wow. Yeah. And it's, it's
Oh, there
uncanny.
it is.
There
So
we are.
that's right, top left there. There you have it. So if that's the top-down view of hydrogen, by equation, what's happening is the waves are adding and multiplying recursively, constructively, not just their wavelength, but the phase velocity. So that means only in that geometry of compression does the phase velocity add and multiply recursively, constructively. And that turns that geometry of compression, which is called fractal, into acceleration of charge towards center, which is named the gravity. So now, unlike Einstein, Stephen Hawking, and NASA, you know why objects fall to the ground, because you get charge acceleration towards center. Charge acceleration, as Einstein proved, there's no experiment that could differentiate acceleration from gravity.
Wow. Wow. So let that soak in, folks.
You just learned why objects fall to the ground. Your physics teacher was embarrassed when your 5-year-old asked and he had no answer. Now you can answer. It's important because that's the same reason that consciousness exists. That's the reason a seed germinates, and that's what makes sacred space. And if you understand that, you can take something through death. It's very important.
Right. Well, and it's almost like, invisible container, so to speak. I mean, our consciousness would seemingly float away without this gravity. And maybe that's what's going on during out-of-body experiences and astral projections.
Exactly. And we'd like to be a lot more electrical engineering about that. If you interview the medical doctors who just came back from their near-death experience, and they describe where they were in the room when they were outside your body, you learn a few things like, you cannot be outside your body in a metal box. Nope. Because what you take with you when you remote view, astral travel, near death, and at death is a plasma tornado, which dies inside metal boxes. Oh, are your kids going to a metal school? That's a disaster.
Well, yeah, all of our infrastructure seems to be replaced by metal and steel, steel being primary. And
so that introduces the physics of biologic architecture, bioarchitects.net. And so the physics of the way we determine which architects should get a paycheck, and this is now a movement that's going global, is we take that building and we measure the low frequency capacitance, and we predict by measurement which building, because it's centripetal, will cause a seed to grow and your child. And that's how we determine which architect should get a paycheck. Now, it turns out if you made that building of steel and aluminum, the seed's going to die. And the architect should also, because that's called biofeedback, actually. So once you know what life force is, you would never put steel and aluminum in a building if you could help it, because the dielectric constant is wrong. That's why if you sleep in a building made of all biologic material, you can dream and survive death.
Wow. Now, I wonder what that says about the houses I've lived in. I've had no problem dreaming in my past house and this house, so maybe I'm doing all right. But
well, the theory would be, for example, if the roof was metal, it's less able for dreaming propagation, because it's the dielectric constant that gets you.
Well, and that's where I wanted to ask you, because I recently had a architect on the show who builds these very beautiful structures that are certainly in tune with the theory you just shared. And I know he's probably well aware of a lot of these concepts, but when it comes to the landscape itself, one thing that this architect taught me was that there are paramagnetic landscapes and there are diamagnetic landscapes. And I'm wondering if that has something to do with, let's say, the potential for a building to blossom this seed, right? If we're building out of materials that are in concert, in harmony with the surrounding landscape, does that multiply the effect?
That's a very appropriate question, and it brings us to the electrical engineering, which is very useful. So first of all, I was referring to something called dielectric constant, which is charge distribution efficiency for a capacitor. So most material that have at one time been alive, like limestone and natural fabric and wood, the molecules have rejoined the geometry called fractal because they love that club because it enables distribution of charge. So most everything that was once alive has this higher dielectric constant, means it can breathe the charge of your aura, the Kaaba, as it were, and enable lucid dreaming. Now, parallel to that, you bring up, which is very useful, is actually Professor Phil Callahan, with whom I worked for many years, who emphasized that paramagnetic diamagnetic. And one of the simplest ways to think about that is, I was actually in Wells in UK once recently, well, it's a while back, and the cathedral there is made of sandstone. That is diamagnetic. And I must say, when you go in that cathedral, in terms of emotion, it's dead. Whereas if you go in a cathedral made of limestone, your hair stands up, man. Okay, so see, paramagnetic means it is coherently conductive to magnetic lines. Diamagnetic means it will tend to break up magnetic lines. Obviously, sandstone is more fractionated. So that's an example. So what Callahan did was, he's going down the Amazon and realizes that he needs to predict in advance which tribe are headhunters. So he measures whether the soil is paramagnetic or diamagnetic, whether it conduct magnetic flux. And if the soil can conduct magnetic flux, the natives in the next village are going to be friendly. If the soil cannot conduct magnetic flux, diamagnetic, then the natives in the next village are going to be headhunters. And that became the physics of how you teach peacemaking. Peacemaking is charge distribution efficiency. So Ireland, Yugoslavia, Israel, they actually proved that when the magnetic line between village A and village B breaks, that's when war breaks out. They predicted, they measured it, it works. And when you restore the water table and the magnetic lines, peace breaks out. Peaceuniversity.net. So the whole science of peacemaking is based on the negentropy of the fractality of permissive magnetics.
Incredible. Wow. And I did want to get along to bringing up ley lines at some point. I think we're already here. What is the connection between ley lines and that magnetic line you just described? Is that just another term, maybe a more common term for the same phenomena?
Well, remember, there's several different kinds of magnetic rivers in the planet. The strictly classic magnetic line, the example I would give is when Kozyrev was setting up the Kozyrev mirror, which is a metal tube microwave coherent, and you got military quality telepathy across the planet, you could only put it where the magnetic line crossed. That's a DC magnetic flux, magnetic line. And they specified in nanoteslas, you measure it, and then you find out where you're going to get military grade telepathy at the magnetic line cross. So that is a longitudinal coherence, which is the physics of telepathy. So that is a classic magnetic line. Now you have the Hartman, Pei, Curry. These are lines which have an AC component whose frequency actually our friend describes in our article on this, Stefan Cardinot, the leading geobiology school of the planet, which is all the frequencies, et cetera, goldenmean.info/geobiology. So you have the AC and the DC components. But the simple physics is, and this is maybe the simplest way to think about it, the reason the pyramid builders, which is basically the Federation Andromeda Consortium, were successful in making a very effective global wireless power grid, those pyramids, we've measured the power spectra, it's all Golden ratio times Planck. So the Schumann harmonic cascade in the piezo pyramid is a phase conjugate pump wave compressionally pumping a longitudinal into the array. So not only to get the frequencies right, but they got the positions right at a longitudinal net array, which is this geometry called star mother kit, Goldman and kit, stellate dodeca. So the Earth grid nodes that enable global wireless power and telepathy and all the magics of healing and whatever is a longitudinal array, which is fractal. So the nodes of the magnetic lines inhabit that fractal because that's where the compression can bounce in and out between the longitudinal distribution and the localized transverse, which is where you can achieve action at a distance, which is the only physics possible with only possible with longitudinal array. So another example of magnetic lines and global wireless power grids. And incidentally, Tesla did not get any of that right. He had the frequencies wrong and he had the nodal positions wrong.
Wow. Now, I like that we've brought this term up, nodal point or nodal position,
Yeah.
because a friend of mine who's been on this show several times, I'm almost certain he's a friend of yours too, an author named Peter Shampoo.
Oh yeah, sure, yes.
He talks a lot about these.
He calls it our comb.
Right. And what's so fascinating about Peter's work at first for me was I had it stuck in my mind that ley lines were these linear, patterns. Well, Peter elaborated that no, these are actually three-dimensional bubbles that are sort of biomes over the landscape, and certain human-made markers are built at the center points and the sort of nodal points around these biomes, and they often take a varying size but a circular form, always circular.
Well, if you look at the infinite stellation of Dodeca, which is the fractal of hydrogen and makes a rose, which is the proven Earth grid geometry from anti-gravity in the world grid, which is where Peter Shampoo started. So the actual trajectory between the major compression nodes is always a straight line. However, the path between them also is the curvature, which is possible electrically, is a golden spiral, which the golden spiral is what he called our comb. The Templars called it the Rochelle grid, which basically looks like a Valentine. And so, yes, the dome geometries are based on the unpacking of that fractal. So, but the actual compression path for the electric line starts with a straight line, and then the bubble that builds implies the spiral, the golden spiral.
Fascinating. Now, when you say it looks like a Valentine, do you mean like our traditional kind of heart shape that we, not the shape of a human heart, but the sort of, anthropomorphized version of that?
And God, do we have images of that? Well, that's the classic Holy Grail science, that if you rotate that spiral path towards center, I mean, too many videos here, but you actually see that the side view of that path is the golden spiral, but the top down view is actually here, let's take. So if I play, I don't know if you can see this. It should play. Oh, there it goes. Okay.
Oh yeah, we can see this.
So did you see a Valentine there? I saw there's Valentine. By God.
Absolutely. Wow.
And there's the spirals.
Right.
And this is how that geometry enables compression, because you can change scale without changing ratio. And it really sucks. That's implosion. And so it's called scale invariance. So that's the top-down view. And maybe I can dig out the Grail animation. So it's a flame that does not consume because implosion is enabled. I don't think we have the Grail animation here. I've been doing this for 30 years.
Back to that 0 point energy in a way, right? With this
there's the Templar Rochelle grid right there.
Okay, yeah.
That is it. And there's the top and the side view. There's the Grail animation, basically.
Not quite the wide heart that we're familiar with, the chocolates coming in these, shapes, boxes. But yeah, it's sort of like a more angled heart shape. That's very, very fascinating. And I guarantee that's the more appropriate explanation for why we have this heart symbol in our symbol language, right?
That's right, because the name for the romance is the fusion that's enabled by implosive compression. I mean, to the point that literally our realheartcoherence.com tech, which enables hearts to link by measurement, is used to teach Tantra, because it's literally embeddability of EKG.
Well, and how much of what we're just witnessing there goes on in our brain chemistry? Because I've heard you use the term brain cascade before, and I'm wondering, if this type of sacred geometry is going on in our minds, maybe biochemically or even electromagnetically.
Well, we have been doing the brainwaves for Bliss for over 20 years. Currently, our tech for that is flameinmind.com. And yeah, so here would be some examples. So this is, I think this is 5 harmonics in golden ratio in the EEG. This is actually me. I hear the delta is even stronger but that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 harmonics in golden ratio. That's a peak bliss experience moment. So the brain is literally making that stairway to heaven. That's the implosive step ladder, and that's flameinmind.com. And that does make bliss measurable and to some extent teachable. So this is the history of the literature of golden ratio and EEG. There's a lot of that. This is all at flameandmind.com. But the thing that's really fun then is if we tracked Jean-Charles Moyen, who was repeatedly bilocating with witnesses, it's extreme form of lucid dreaming. We can trigger lucid dreams. That's what Therify.net plasma does, among other things. But in his case, just before he would bilocate, in one eye he would see where he was, in the other eye he saw where he was going. And it's because of this physics. It's literally turning inside out. So, but the power spectrum of the EEG at that moment, if you see down at the bottom here, is a stairway to heaven of golden ratio and octave harmonics between alpha and gamma. And that implosive stairway is literally the physics of, this is how children see without their eyes, with exactly that spectrum. And at higher amplitude, it's the physics of how a portal and a stargate works.
Wow. And this brings a whole nother dimension to something I've been researching, the dumbing down of our education system. It seems like there's a physical component to this, and people are actually being shut off, so to speak, when they go into these buildings. And I wonder over time how that can constrict a person, and you multiply that by an office job and being stuck in traffic in a busy city. I mean, all of these are impacting us, huh?
Well, in other words, until we're able to teach our children what bliss is, because literally that charge implosion is the only way you get an aura coherent enough to lucid dream, and that defines who's going to take memory through death for sure. So literally, it's the only form of immortality takes, actually. And our term body polis refers to the plasma of that bliss body. So the term politic, biologically, for example, beehive can't swarm unless. So the term politics, by definition, biologically means, is there collective bliss? If there is not, the tribe is not navigable. So until we can teach the biology of bliss, and the Aboriginals were quite correct, you do not have culture if you cannot teach your child how to have a bliss experience, period.
Wow. And this it goes without saying for a man who's done as much research as you, but I feel like you're sort of explaining the physics of this spiritual war that we're all in. And there are many metaphors in fiction to kind of give us a, Borg or a sort of, name for these people. But it does seem like the ultimate goal, whoever they may be, is to shut off our soul's capacity to remember after death.
I've been teaching the mechanics of extraterrestrial history for 20 years, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. But the story to that whole Maury, whether you believe in Enki or not, doesn't matter, is if you can have a bliss experience and if you can teach the biology of bliss and understand, because that's literally what makes you star navigable, that coherence. It's called the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan body, rainbow light body. So the actual electrical engineering of the coherence of the aura, and that's the difference between those who have a soul and those who don't. So whether we want to call it some great, huge, evil plot or simple stupidity is also irrelevant. The fact is, we need education.
Brilliant. Yeah, I agree. I don't think it really necessarily needs to be chalked up to some grand, villain.
Either way, whatever. Teach your kids the science of bliss, and it's the most empowering science there is.
Well, and this is why history, I think, has become so fascinating, at least for me, because we seem to have a glimpse of a time where human beings lived for that as their highest intention. The structures of our ancient civilizations seem to have this sort of physics of magic in mind, built into it. I mean, I've heard you talk about pharaohs and their bodies having this sort of gold powder associated with it. I'm wondering if you can explain that a little further, and maybe we can elaborate on, this process of death and reincarnation, not as a, physical immortality, but as a spiritual one.
Well, again, those who think physical is separate from the spiritual, they have a problem with schizophrenia, first of all. But because what we have been calling spiritual is literally only the coherence of the longitudinal array around a biologic plasma body, which has the feature of being able to compress well. That's what the immortality is. That's the ba from the ka. So we like to joke that the reason mummy powder was served in every pharmacy in Europe for 300 years, originally we thought those Egyptians were eating a lot of gold powder, but actually that ain't quite the. Actually, the dielectric constant of the natron in the mummy was implosive enough to alchemically transmute flesh into a rhodium iridium ormes emulet, literally a form of gold powder, which traces back to the physics of Osiris, who was actually Enki, who, by the way, just came back. He's in Ganymede having a lot of fun. It's quite a story. That's Elena Denon. I work with her on this too. But the lesson they brought to teach at that time, I was joking with Graham Hancock. Well, I worked with Graham Hancock when I founded Gaia TV with Ray Jay Widener. But actually, I sent Graham Hancock a letter lately about his ancient apocalypse. Every single ancient culture he bumps into, or he says, suddenly they went from hunter-gatherers to agriculture, and it all happened when, the Great Dryad, the Great Flood. And I said, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, Osiris, Zoroaster, every single ancient mythological character he bumps into that he says was the magic ancient culture, every single one is another name for Enki, Hermes, Thoth. Hello, it's all done with mirrors, man. And their lesson, called the Caduceus, was now called phase conjugation, the origin of life force. That is hermetically sealed, the lesson.
Wow. So this is that alchemical secret encoded in the Caduceus. Now, to go back to what we were talking about with architecture and temple building, I heard you also say that alchemy is a sort of inherent property of these buildings, right? They were constructing buildings in order to facilitate an alchemical process. It wasn't sort of what we think of as like a laboratory experiment with beakers and different materials and chemicals. It was more the physics of the temple itself allowed for this transmutation within the mind, within the body.
Right there. So the term alchem, the L, the phase shift into chem, access to a black hole as in alchemy, refers to the physics of non-destructive charge compression, which is literally the electrical answer to cold fusion. Literally, I mean, we have the equations for the isotope transition from every virtual valuable isotope transition in the atomic table. So alchemy is very good physics for non-destructive charge collapse. But how that applies to cathedral building in the sense of when you see the ancient cathedral have a series of carvings on the side wall called cyma erecta or cyma reversa, which referred to whether the Earth's plasma was directed upward or downward, turns out that those carvings, for example, on the pyramid walls, are literally microwave antennas, to the point that that's how the insects nearby navigate measurably. Oh yeah, these are microwave antennas. And that microwave implosion is part of the physics of the alchemy of ancient cathedrals. That's Fulcanelli, basically. So the design of a building, both capacitively, dimensionally, and materials-wise, is all about implosion. And that implosion, which is the only real meaning of the term alchemy at all, is both, it's piezoelectric, it's magnetic, it's microwave, it's infrasound, it's all of the above. And the geometry of that implosion is always golden ratio to Planck. So that implosion is the origin of life, and that's what makes a building a plasma projector, which is the definition of raising of the Jed, as in the Jedi and the Jed Tower.
Huh. Now, I've never heard of a raising of the Jed. Is this from the sort of...
You didn't follow Luke Skywalker when he went underground?
I know it from Star Wars. I'm wondering if there's a historical...
Well, the Jed, in other words, and then they measured his blood for microclaridians to determine if he was a Jedi. Well, it turns out that the plasma in the blood there's something called the somatids and the microzymes. And we can measure it like after the jab. No. So the plasma emission of the blood tells you whether you're imploding. And by the way, that's if you can steer the time chair at Montauk, and whether you're a Jedi. It's literally the raising of the Jed. Now, Jed towers in Egypt were a golden ratio cascade between the piezo capacitance of the stone. But the term Jed itself simply meant plasma projective, which is why the ancient stone carvings of the plasma tubes is the logo for Therify.net, because in the Bible they call it, I will raise a Shem unto the Lord. Then they mistranslated the word Shem to be, I will raise an altar. Mistranslation. Actually, Sitchin said highward firestone. Actually, it is implosive capacitance. There those Anunnaki were. Their biggest complaint was they started aging catastrophically the minute they got here. So what did they do? They raised a Shem unto the Lord. This was age-reversing implosive negentropy. That's what those plasma tubes they call the pyramid light bulb. It's actually the logo for Therify.net for that reason. It is the physics of negentropic rejuvenation, a Jed.
Wow. Now, where does the Kaaba fit into this equation? Because it seems like they're proximal. I mentioned Peter Shampoo before, and he has in his Moon Rivers book the Great Pyramids at Egypt and the Kaaba in this sort of phi ratio relationship to one another.
Well, the Kaaba story kind of starts with one of the better glass meteorites. The only metal that survived the heat of impact was gold, palladium, platinum group metals, which formed a foam of vaporized gold in the array of the glass meteor, later called the Kaaba stone. And all the alchemists of the day, of course, they were grinding up and eating it as they did in that day for immortality. And that's how the mad caliph, who sold half the volume of the Kaaba stone, proven historically, went mad, actually. But then they ground that up later, and that's how John Dee and Flamel both made gold. And it was called the philosopher's stone, the projected powder. It was a red powder. And the reason is because you take that foam of gold vapor in that glass matrix. That is the physics of how you make the ultimate super dielectric. So a little bit of that powder and you get the temperature of the mercury correct. And then if you have the phonon array. And Dee and Kelly then made the purest gold ever measured historically by the leading science of the day, the British Royal Society. And that's proven. This is not a myth. No. This is well-proven history, many transmutations. And that is a short introduction to physics, that the catalysis for the isotope transitions was the super dielectric propagating in the matrix. And there was a wetting agent, some other involved. So that was the cotton. Later it was called Lucifer's eye. Well, you rotate around in a certain direction around the Kaaba because the implosive capacitance serves as the center of the vortex. Unfortunately, we believe that this head then at that time was infected by the black goo. It's a sort of another story, but there's a carbon nanomaterial which is also used by the bad guys, that's another story.
Well, and I do want to hear more about that, but as we're on this point of the, Kaaba and the ritual and the ceremony of rotating around it, I thought this would be a kind of bridge into this larger concept. And you see it throughout most of human cultures, this, lighting a fire, dancing in a circle around it. I mean, it's a pretty human thing to do. I don't know if we can pin it to any one culture because it seems to be universal. Do you think that this is sort of a more specialized version of the very same thing, given that, they're circling a meteor rather than just, wood burning?
Well, ancient tribes in their trance dance, they had one thing that most modern religious rituals don't, which was astral hygiene. So here's the ancient tribe. They're dancing around the fire and they're going into bliss and trance. And then the voices of the ancestor shows up. And this is tremendous survival value. However, the strong intent by every member of the extended family that the only plasma going to be allowed to do this phone call will be our ancestors. Very strong, focused intent. That's called astral hygiene. And that means none of the bad ghosts get to make phone calls. Hello. So where's the astral hygiene in our modern rituals? There's a problem. And that's how the Greys and the Dracos got in here in the first place, basically, is bad astral hygiene.
Well, and does it start with rituals like the kind John Dee was messing around with? I mean, we often hear people in the sort of maybe more fundamentalist Christian camp of conspiracy say, "Oh, Dee summoned demons, and the world's never been the same since." I mean, is there
Michael
truth?
Sarian says that about Dee specifically.
Right.
And he brings up some very interesting points. Vincent Bridges, who clearly had the memories of Kelly, said, I had the memories of Dee. Well, am I defensive about this? No. I think John Dee did have some astral hygiene problems. Absolutely. But there's so much instructive here. First, remember, John Dee is studying scintillation as a way to phone ancestors, the same way the Olmec used high dielectric stone, so the ancestors would appear in that stone, which later was an obsidian mirror. It's basically a phase conjugate mirror, the same coating Nostradamus used. So that point of phase conjugation enables embedding in the longitudinal array, and that is the physics of ancestor memory, clearly. And can you do that with astral hygiene? Well, I don't think actually John Dee had that level of discrimination. No, he and Kelly exchanged wives because these dummies said get promiscuous. That is a classic indicator of bad astral hygiene, actually. So, John Dee was absolutely a genius, incredible progress. But some of the points that Michael Sarian makes about John Dee actually are useful food for thought. These people are not like evil, but not understanding that all interstellar plasma beings are the good guys. That would be step number one.
Right. That's like assuming every animal in the jungle is your friend, right?
Well, and so then when they use the Ophanim-Enochian alphabet from John Dee to make the movie Stargate, essentially the plasma convergence point of that's those hypercube letters. It becomes a Stargate because that's the implosion point through into the longitudinal array where you get that acceleration. And the astral hygiene to use a Stargate portal, that is some advanced stuff. And clearly the Montauk, Philadelphia people got that wrong.
Interesting. Yeah. And I will say one day, I was probably 17 or 18 years old. I go into a witchy type tarot card reading shop and I find an obsidian mirror. And Mr. Winter, I'll tell you, I had an experience of bliss staring into that mirror. I don't know. I mean, you know the sensation. I'm sure people listening have felt this sort of like time speeding up, or even like how long was I just staring at that kind of feeling. Well, I got that when I looked at this obsidian mirror, and although I wasn't doing a sophisticated ritual, I wonder, is there a potential with an object like that to leave a seed behind in someone's mind, or cause a change that could affect them later on in life, and maybe not necessarily know it was that obsidian mirror that did that?
In order to think about the astral hygiene of using obsidian mirrors for ancestor phone calls, which is John Dee's showstone and the coating in Nostradamus' cup, it's important to understand a bit about the physics of how a phase conjugate mirror enables ancestral communication. So what the Aboriginals called the songline dreaming track, which is the road of ancestor memory, is actually specifically a longitudinal array of nodal points. So Professor Karatkov follows the Kogi to where they make phone calls to ancestors, and every time they only go to the place where air is fractal, namely harmonic inclusive, where that's a compression node, enabling phone calls, impedance matching to that longitudinal array, sometimes called Heaven, Plains of Sharon, or Champs-Élysées. So those nodes, access to those nodes is ancestral memory. That's why the Kozyrev mirror worked. But normally, you use natural biological nodes to achieve that, and you're closer to astral hygiene. When you use externalized mechanism of projection, the externalized mirror, for example, that's when you need to understand astral hygiene a little bit better, because presumably even in John, it is said that John Dee and Kelly's showstone, their black stone mirror, was actually originally Aztec. And that had been used in families doing human sacrifice. And so clearly there was some messy astral hygiene in there that I don't think Dean Kelly understood.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see this sort of worsen or become more extreme with figures like Aleister Crowley and maybe even some serial killers that have become famous over the past few years. Not that I'm an expert in that, but I do want to bring up Cozy Rev mirrors because we don't trust Wikipedia around here for everything. They're technically a good source of information, but we find often that that's not the case. And I'm reading here that it says the Cozy Rev mirror is made out of long sheets of aluminum. Is that an error? Maybe a intentional sort of error put in there to throw people off? Because given what we were talking about aluminum and steel before, it doesn't sound like it would be a good material to use in this type of device.
I would say it was not biologic. There were clear limitations. However, the very specific delimited diameter achieved strong microwave coherence. Now, advanced people understand a little bit of the microwave physics of telepathy. For example, the 1.91 angstrom of adenosine diphosphate, the most important molecule in the body. Actually, you can use that frequency to measure Kundalini up the spine and history of trauma. So, the microwave guide physics is not just insect navigation, as Callahan taught, but it is literally the physics of bliss. So that strong tuned microwave, and now we know we could tune the diameters of those Cozy Rev mirrors a lot better than Cozy Rev now that we understand how to tune to Planck. But that was a very powerful embedding into the microwave array. So there was some function there.
Okay, and I'm still sort of unclear on what the Cozy Rev mirror is actually made
Well, they
of.
called it a mirror, but it's in fact a metal cylinder.
Okay.
And the metal cylinder focused the microwave. And if you did that on the nodal array, remember that's the same nodal array that Bruce Cathy proved dramatic reduction in nuclear critical mass, and the Cozy Rev proved is the physics of telepathy. So that was a way of microwave embedding in the fractal nodal array of the Earth. It's literally the pinprick of moxibustion on a global scale. I mean, it was powerful. I'm not saying steel aluminum is always evil, but I'm saying from that point, you could ride that microwave. Absolutely, yes. Now, could you have done it, let's say, more blissfully in a biologic dielectric? Probably, absolutely, yes. But if you understood how to do the microwave tuning to conjugate, you'd need some skill.
Absolutely. Okay, now I'm starting to understand a little bit better. Now, back to you mentioned Nostradamus's cup. I had never heard that it had a certain specific quality.
Yeah, well, that's another secret that came from Vincent Bridges.
Let's hear it.
He learned that in Torino. Nostradamus learned that in Torino. It's the coating on the bottom. See, the water in the cup approximates a phase conjugate mirror, but on the bottom coating, like literally a mirror on the bottom of the cup, you need a super dielectric material. Hello. In those days, they didn't know what barium strontium titanate was, Alice in barium titanate land. No. So this was a secret at that time. And Nostradamus learned to put a coating on the, absolutely. That is history doesn't know, but our people who remembered those lifetimes, Vincent Bridges, Nostradamus was sitting on Vincent Bridges' shoulders when he was starring in a dozen History Channel episodes on Nostradamus. It's a scream, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nostradamus is often brought up in the same conversation as the end of the world, Armageddon, this sort of prophet of destruction or doom.
Yep. The other key point there is that Nostradamus was regularly weeping for those whose pain he saw. That is an important point. So what actually sucked the future to him was empathy. The same definition who could steer the time chair at Montauk. It's called a time empath. That is the implosion that gives you leverage.
Now, that empathy, is there a chance that, given what the observer effect tells us, maybe Nostradamus was projecting his, perspective from his lifetime onto this vision of the future, maybe seeing the sort of resonant aspects of the future, maybe because he was coming from that dark age empathetic perspective, he saw things that resembled that in the future.
like he called Hitler Hister, for example. Well, and the further you go forward in time, the more the fractionation of timelines makes those visions, let's say, multivalent.
Mhm.
So it's a very tricky procedure. But if you have that great coherence, then you can, you can penetrate into the future certain distance. If remember, most of what we call time travel, as it's been measured in physics, is time reversal, which we now know is defined only by negentropy, meaning although physics has measured time reversal, they can measure how you can turn rusted steel into unrusted, but you cannot do the reverse. In other words, you cannot time reverse toward disorder. Physics won't allow it. What does that tell you? First of all, you need to know that time is only a name for rate of rotation, rate of spin. That's all it's a name for. So the reason time speeds up when you accelerate is just the translation of vorticity. The spin rate changes. That's it. It's that simple. All this crap about time-space continuum is pure confusion.
Mm, okay. Now that with that in mind, where does that leave us between here and the future, and how is it because there's no distance, it's just a difference in frequency that we're able to see in the so-called future?
Well, think about the basics here. If someone in a building has a very strong emotion, say at the time of death, there is a shadow in the longitudinal array that would make that visible from great distance. Any kind of clairvoyance or, shaman could see it. Well, so that strong shadow in time, an imprint in the longitudinal array, becomes a leverage point in time travel, basically strong emotions. So travel to the past and these sort of things is pretty basic, and there's dozens of examples. But travel to the future gets much more complicated and much more, shall we say, multivalent. Just to begin that study, think about what the Templars meant by the repair of the fabric of time, restoring the fractality. So when, Montauk and Philadelphia tore a rip in the fabric of time, what they meant was a rip in the fractal rose-like pattern of the Earth's aura. And that's why they say too many Greys and Dracos got in here. Literally a tear in the fabric of the Earth's aura.
And was this the result of the Philadelphia experiment and
That was
Montauk?
one example of ripping up the fabric of time and therefore making us more susceptible to parasites. Yes.
What about the Trinity site nuclear testing? Because there's
Exactly. You're starting to get the logic here, aren't you? Why did all of the ETs show up immediately thereafter?
right.
Oops.
Right. Well, and there's also, I've heard you talk about uh the creation of a golem and how there's certain implosion that comes along with that. And
Yeah.
Michael A. Hoffman writes in his Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare that there was a metal dummy at the Trinity test site that some people thought of as a golem or a being inside of this metal container. Now, what does that sort of tell you?
Well, just a little bit to think about the physics of golem. Remember, the Hebrew letters are just the shadow of a plasma donut indexed by tetracubic lattice symmetry. It's the origin of Hebrew and Sanskrit. So if you hold one Hebrew letter in the optical cortex hologram at a time, very slowly, the plasma donut will form in a very specific tilt angle. And then you blow those smoke rings in sequence. That's how you build a golem. You're just blowing plasma donuts in symmetry. See, that's it. Now, those plasma donuts originally were pretty damn mechanical, but very high level parasites use very advanced form of that, hint black goo. And when these huge astral black holes show up, when these stupid humans begin unraveling their own nest called nuclear, that's when the big parasites arrive. It ain't good.
Right. And I'm wondering if there are sort of reverse things that we can do to reverse that, right? I mean, Peter Shampoo, I mentioned before, he's been on the show a few times, and one of his stated goals is to water the West, and how he plans on doing that is by conducting certain ceremonies in conjunction with the placement of stones in specific spots that have a relationship with the atmosphere in order to create this river in the sky and rewater the West. I mean, can we do something akin to that with this astral rift that's opened? Is there a way for us to maybe create something here on the planet Earth that can reverse those effects?
Oh, exactly the right question. Boy, you're thinking very appropriately this evening. Congratulations for asking the right questions. And by the way, Peter Shampoo's intent there, I think, is fabulous. I'm with him all the way. So our website, goldenmean.info/rain, for example, would directly confirm exactly what he's saying. So you re-steer these magnetic lines for a whole bioregion to look like a rose. For example, Witherspoon's Sri Yantra, the size of multiple football fields with paramagnetic sand in the trench, they created microclimate for the whole bioregion. Man, we did that in Torino also, actually. It's all at goldenmean.info/labyrinth, goldenmean.info/Italian. So absolutely, rainfall. In fact, when we did our labyrinth ritual for our Tremurti on the Mediterranean conference, they had the biggest storm the next day they had in 10 years, man. The elementals went crazy after we did that labyrinth work. And that's the key to the Brazilians who saved their village from the fire by doing our labyrinth ritual. The film, goldenmean.info/rain. So Peter Shampoo is absolutely on the right track. And while we're on the subject, I need to mention Malcolm Borgward in Perth. He figured out the reason Australia is a desert because the female and male shaman of every Aboriginal tribe for thousands of years have been at war with each other. That's why it's a desert, because that's straight Draco, by the way. So he goes across the continent doing rituals to heal the men and the women tribe, and huge rainstorms follow them every time. Wow. So it is all about healing the practicality of the land. Shampoo's got that exactly right. Yes. And as far as, yes, can we heal the nuclear? Well, I give one physics example. After Bruce Cathy proved that Earth grid magnetic line cross points dramatically reduced nuclear critical mass, think about that. Like, why did the Ark of the Covenant contain radioactivity? That's what it's built for. Then think about the amazing Andrei Puharic's friend there, who was famous for bending metal. But he measured that focused human attention reduces radioactivity measurably. Hello. So
Ingo Swann, you're thinking of? Swann?
Ingo Swann, I knew him quite well. No, I was thinking of Yuri Geller, actually. That's what I was thinking.
Okay.
But Ingo Swann's the one who lit a flame with his mind at a distance. That's why our app is called flameinmind.com after him. Actually, the story's there. But so the point was that Bill Tiller proved in the book Conscious Acts of Creation dozens of times, focused human attention causes electric fields to implode. That's been measured dozens of ways. No scientist before me has explained why, because the plasma vortex of consciousness is implosive centripetal. Hello. And that centripetal force electrically is the opposite of radioactivity by definition. I was in Keshi's living room when TEPCO called him from Japan and said, "Oh, these nanomaterials, they reduce radioactivity." Hello.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I'm really starting to get a better picture. I hope the audience is too. But it feels almost like we're, these living beings, in this environment that's been, let's say, muted for
let's say fractionated.
Yeah. And people would hear this, maybe they haven't had the background that you or I have, me just being interested in all this stuff, and you clearly doing years and years of research. But the average person on the street, right, not accustomed to any of this type of stuff, they're gonna immediately doubt it, right? Because maybe they've been affected by it, and they just haven't known. They haven't realized that their world has been shut off, and the magic they could have experienced has been hidden from them. It hasn't been removed, but it's been hidden from them. What do you say to people like that? This is the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, so we have people who listen who
my family thinks I'm crazy. No, actually, you're right though. Yeah, I learned something I've taught groups of physicists and advanced cardiologists many times, and I learned one very simple thing that works great. So you gather them, they're all there in the room, and they say, well, who here remembers having had a Bliss experience? Please raise your hand. Okay, now those people go to one side of the room, and the rest go to the other side of the room. And now you know how to talk to them. Hello. See, because once they realize that implosive charge is the only path to immortality, suddenly, they can follow their bliss, they can hear the story. And those who haven't, about the only thing you can do for them is suggest a little bit of the hygiene to get started on following your bliss. When somebody has their own source of bliss, obviously they have their own source of charge, and that is the first day they are not a parasite.
Now, do you think our religions used to have this astral hygiene inherent in the teachings, and somehow this has all been removed? What do you think? Is there a historical marker for this event?
Well, my prejudice here is go back to the ET story. It was Enki versus Enlil. So Enlil wanted slaves. Later called Yahweh. That doesn't speak well for the Jews. Sorry. Enki, well, he was an artist. He wanted his genetic experiment to be a vaccine for the Orion Wars. The Orion Wars was the Draco had lost their long-term memory, and so had the Anunnaki. Long-term memory is defined as ensoulment. Ensoulment is defined as, do you have coherence in the longitudinal array outside your body? Otherwise, there will be nothing after death. So that is the physics of why you must follow your bliss.
Wow. Yeah. And it's fascinating to hear this story has just sort of repeated itself, and it all goes back to this major event. I mean, this is why looking at all these ancient structures around the planet, for me, is very fascinating, because I feel like whatever my intuition has been pushing me towards, there are clues in that. And I'm not alone, obviously, in that instinct. But when we look at the pyramids, we've talked a lot about them. You can learn so much, but there are even lesser known examples of this, like the Olmec heads. You write about the Olmec heads on implosiongroup.com, and I'm wondering what we can sort of learn about the composition of these Olmec heads, and maybe what their purpose is and why they're in the positions they're in.
Yeah, apparently the Olmec were quite willing to walk 60 miles and carry multi-ton stones because the local stones had the wrong dielectric. What does that tell you? They wanted their ancestors to appear in those stones. Looking for the picture. Let me see if I can find it. So it's the same reason the Sekhmet shows up. You can see the eyes glow. Those statues were super dielectric, where the plasma of ancestors could inhabit. Look at that. I even found the picture. I'm good. So there's the black obsidian mirror. There's the Olmec stone heads. They're super dielectric material. And that's what allowed the embedding of the plasma longitudinal coherence, which they called ancestor memory. It's physics, man.
Right. And it's so fascinating to see the parallels in the Aztec and Mayan cultures and the Egyptian cultures. We often, with the modern sort of ignorance, chalk that up to syncretism on the part of the people who went and recorded the oral traditions. But I don't think that's the case. I think what we're looking at is a global civilization that we've been sort of given this illusion of separation, fractionization.
Just remember, every one of these tribes has the equivalent of a tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Viracocha Quetzalcoatl legend. Every one of these tribes. And who was that? That was Enki's science partner, Hermes. And why did he wander around to every ancient indigenous tribe? After you walk the same magnetic line for 1,000 generations, that magnetic line becomes a family pet. So the storm goes 1,000 miles across Australia when Auntie Lorraine dies. So here, why was Hermes and Enki so interested in these indigenous tribes? They were studying the physics of who's going to get a soul. Ooh. So every one of the tribes that Graham Hancock goes to look at, he discovers another version of Enki Hermes and says, somebody was teaching them something. Who was it? Now we know.
Right. Well, and there's an equally enigmatic figure that we don't have to go too far into history to learn about. This Shakespeare, who you write about being involved with John Dee and Edward Kelly. Can we talk a little bit about this guy and who Shakespeare may have actually been?
Yeah. So Shakespeare referred to Kelly in Dee's notebook. Shakespeare was named. I'll think of it here. It
Francis
was
Garland.
Yes, Francis Garland. Thank you. And so every time the character Shakespeare disappears from history for a few months, suddenly Garland shows up in Dee's notebook. What a coincidence. It was Teresa Burns who did that study. It's very elaborately proven. So Shakespeare is there. He's watching Dee and Kelly make this gold, and then he writes, Sorcerer's Apprentice and all these stories. So later, when Shakespeare did all those plays, even his knowledge of the paths of royalty between Italy and Prague, etc., Rudolph's whole court was based on alchemy. The most significant example I can think of at the moment that might be helpful is the cube octa symmetry of the Shakespearean theater. If you track the play's the thing in which we will capture the conscience of the king. In fact, each character in the play goes through a sequence of emotions where everyone identifies with one emotion from this angle, and then you see the next character with that emotion from a different angle. And because it's cube octa symmetry, that's called phase conjugate, that creates something called the possibility of consumed perspective. E pluribus unum, literally, which means the reason, and everybody knows Shakespeare is only about alchemy fundamentally. The alchemy is that at the end of the play, everyone suddenly identifies with every character as if they were one with them. Why? Because of the fusion of that precise symmetry, both of emotion and angle of perspective.
Wow. That's incredible. Thank you for elaborating on that. And you do have a lot more information on all of this on your website. The links are in the description.
Fractalfield.com/alchemy of fusion.
Right. And I do want to just focus on the name Francis Garland, because it seems Garland is a sort of
because a garland of roses was King Rudolph's symbol for everything spiritual. He carried the famous painting across the mountains of the Garland of Roses. So the Garland brothers, it's sort of like bend over and rolled over, but they were all the Garland brothers in those days. So John Dee's notebook is a scream.
Okay, I see. Yeah, and I did find something here that says Garland, that there's a day called Garland's Day, and it was tradition on that day that a rough bell or beehive-shaped wooden framework would be tied with bunches of garden flowers. And I find that fascinating because the beehive symbol appears over and over again. And I'm wondering what we can learn from the physics of
I think Lawrence Gardner in Genesis of the Grail Kings got that right. The Merove, as in the Merovingian symbol, was the busy bees. And the physics is in the harvest of nectar is in fact the harvest of bliss. And, a hummingbird crashes in the window when she has bliss, even though the house is sealed because the infrared gets through. So there's the Steiner school teaching the children how to visualize a rose, and the test for success, if the room fills with the smell of roses, that's infrared, man.
Wow. Yeah, and we see this bee symbol over and over again. Even the Freemasons use the beehive symbol. Is there something about the hexagrammal nature to a beehive?
Well, yes, but it is the body polis. The reason the beehive cannot swarm without the presence of the royal blood is navigation.
Right.
And the implosion that's called royal blood is effectively access to bliss. So, when the Draco, they couldn't put Humpty together again, even though all the king's horses and all the king's men. Well, Humpty Dumpty was the royal families of Europe for 1,000 years, played with like they were show dogs because they were trying to make a soul. That's what Genesis of the Grail Kings really means. And that soul is effectively the ability to make a collective bliss plasma cocoon, which makes a gene pool navigable, leading their to leading the gene pool to a new home in the sun. You can't steer a gene pool to a collective dream, lucid dream together unless, and that's nectar, man.
Now, is this the goal of esoteric monarchy, to sort of create this like collective bliss state by being the like externalized compartmental bliss of the whole, species, so to speak?
Well, according to Lawrence Gardner or Anton Parks, depends who you believe, the original reason the Draco, who we used to call God, invented royalty was because they couldn't stand the sound of these damn humans copulating at night. So it was a little less romantic originally, but the subtle intention behind Genesis of the Grail Kings was, these were the royal families were simply babysitters who were supposed to relay the instructions of God. In this case, it was Enlil. So originally it didn't start out quite that romantic, but the quote unquote unconscious impulse behind the reason the Anunnaki were called fallen was specifically because of that lost long-term memory, which indicates loss of soul. So when the Anunnaki and really the Nebu, the Greys and the Dracs, did the abductions after the Greyada Treaty, 90% of the abductions had some indigenous blood. Why? They were lucid dreamers. Why? Because they walked barefoot in the same land. And so that was what they needed. That was the DNA recipe. And that is actually basically the only thing valuable, really valuable on this planet. They don't buy and sell. They like our beer, but mostly what they buy and sell on 10,000 humanoid cultures in this galactic sector, the value is DNA. That's what they trade. And DNA that has a soul, man,
Right.
That's the value.
Wow.
That's so the meaning of royal blood was, and Humpty Dumpty, the egg's broken. We couldn't make a kid with a soul. Oh dear.
Wow. That's incredible.
They're looking for the lucid dreamers, man.
Yeah, no.
Study that physics. It's fun.
Yeah, thank you. That's new to me, and I'm really fascinated to take that new rabbit hole to its depths. But
when Therify.net, when you see we regularly trigger lucid dreams, that lucidity is the plasma implosion that allows us to project coherently, longitudinally into that array. And so that's what enables you to propagate in the dream and at death.
Right. Now, let's talk about that a little more. If I go to Therify.net, will I experience a lucid dream hypothetically in the next few months if I make it a regular practice to go here?
We're not going to make claims. What I can say is Paul attempted some rough statistics on this, and we believe approximately 30%, particularly of women who use Therify a couple times, have some sharpening of vision. We talked about the physics of that at length. And B, have some bliss experience. Now, the actual lady who wrote the big article on lucid dreaming at Therify.net in the blog is quite an advanced shaman. I have to be honest with you. But she had amazing lucid dream triggers. And this has been replicated, but it's not for everybody doesn't get a lucid dream right away. But that's why, using the plasma is useful and fun and worth an experiment, and I recommend it. But I'm not saying you need that in order to. No, I'm not saying that.
And I should be clear. It's a device that you place an order for, and you have it in your home. Is this something you would use daily, or?
Well, you can. I mean, like with me, I have too much Kundalini, so I don't use it. I use it when I need it. Like when I had COVID 2 years ago, it helped tremendously for me, actually. But I don't use it every day. But then what I was going to say about lucid dreaming is, you become aware of where you sleep, how you align yourself magnetically. You keep a dream. I mean, there's dozens of books on how to lucid dreaming. It's good. But now there's new scientific articles showing the frequencies they use to trigger lucid dreaming. And guess what? My equation works. It's so cool. It's all at the lucid dreaming blog at Therify.net. So, the physics is proven. And I'm not saying you need our gadget. I'm just saying our gadget is a helpful proof of principle.
Wonderful. Yeah, no. And It is something that I think people are struggling with in these modern settings. If you live in a city, if you live possibly in a building that has some sort of metal components that
And
might.
lots of electrosmog, and oh my God.
Right, right. So yeah, it does seem like, if you can't move out into the middle of nowhere like some of us, then, you might want to think about an option like that. But I do want to sort of shift gears a little bit. You mentioned hydrogen before, and now that we're on the topic of these devices, I have a really interesting device called the AquaCure that was sent to me by George Wiseman, and it sort of creates this Brown's gas, which is a form of hydrogen that you can breathe in. You can also bubble it in water and drink it. And yeah, a lot of people have experienced wonderful health benefits because this hydrogen, for the most part, has been stripped from our food, and the way that we would have normally got this hydrogen through our food is made harder due to the microbiome of our gut being significantly reduced and all these other effects.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, no, it's true that our best Therify centers now are often using hydrogen nanobubblers both for bathing and drinking. And the synergy with Therify implosive plasma is wonderful. It's clear. And the expensive spas in Japan all have hydrogen nanobubbles, again, bathing and drinking. The physics is clear. The hydrogen in its nanostate is just like gold powder in its nanostate. It's access to implosive fractality. So that's why it's synergetic. It is gorgeous. Some of the devices are a little expensive, but hydrogen nano is absolutely useful. And it's a synergy with what we're doing. Both the imploder.com and therify.net, you add hydrogen nanobubbles, is wonderful.
Right, right. And I'm glad you're able to sort of elaborate on that. We've had George on the show and he told us all about it, but it's cool to hear this from your perspective. Now, on the point of water, it seems that our water has been uh you know, at least in education, we've been taught that water is one thing when clearly it's not. There are thousands of states of water. I mean, obviously, fresh and salt water are what most people think of, but there are a variety of states of water. And I'm curious about, this conversation of energy and fractality, if there is a difference between someone who lives their life for the most part on land and then maybe somebody who goes out and lives at sea. Like historically, have people noticed differences there? I mean, are there different properties of the ocean than there are the land that you can sort of notice through these physics that you're an expert in?
Well, first, let me comment, the many states of water, that the relationship between water in its normal tetracubic ice array versus water when it's most sacred, which is called a clathrate cage. A clathrate cage looks exactly like this. And the analog is perfect. Carbon in its normal tetracubic diamond, if you give it the spark, it becomes fullerenes, the hottest subject in modern chemistry, would look exactly like this. The difference in both cases is a phase conjugate array, literally implosive fractality. So clathrate waters, obviously, is a result of spin density. And we do some of that at theimploder.com. So that's one thing. The next thing in terms of, living on or traveling on the water, I think that book, Psychonavigation, is instructive about how you could use lucid dreaming to navigate ocean spaces. The Maori, all that sort of, the Polynesians could obviously psychonavigate, which is an extension of the psychonavigations of the Templars. The reason this ceiling at Dendera is the best galaxy star map, thousands of years old. How did they know the geometry of the galaxy? They were good lucid dreamers, man. But if I may say, if you've ever been on a cruise, you do not get leverage on magnetic lines sleeping over water. No. The reason is simple. The Aboriginals never left the place of their birth because, the shaman would make a drawing of the magnetic lines of where the baby first leapt in the womb, and that'd be the title deed to the land over which that child was responsible to lucid dream, the dreaming tracks, literally to hold the land together. So that's called abraxas point. The fractality of the place of your birth is therefore where you get maximum leverage on. And so obviously, any geobiologist will tell you, do not sleep over water, because guess what? Your plasma wants to go with that water. So every kid wants to pee when you pass a river, but
Well, and I love that we get into this. I did want to ask you more about water, but briefly, let's talk about this Abraxas point, because I still live in the place of my birth, my hometown.
Aha.
And I wonder if there's something to that for people out there who may feel like they're missing home.
Yeah, there's an imprint in your DNA of the place of birth. Absolutely. And there's leverage there, particularly if the place of your birth had some real magnetic sacred space, then you got leverage. And if your grandparents were there at the moment of conception, and if it was at an equinox solstice and, why the Agni-Hotra works at sunrise, sunset, these are four-wave mixing. This is phase conjugation.
Now, would it be advantageous to go and maybe visit the place of my grandparents' birth? Because I know where they were born in Canada. I mean, what would that mean for?
Well, generally, if you track your lucid dreaming, you can find that the wind in the sails of your lucid dreaming is the yearning at the moment of death of your major ancestors. And that's the direction of the wind in your sails, really. And, if any Aboriginal can tell you, if you're not communicating with your ancestors, you don't have a soul, basically. So, yeah, your ancestral memory as a lineage is an indicator of the wind.
Right. Wow. Now, I'm definitely rethinking my plans for tomorrow. I want to go to the hospital where I was born, not inside, but I wonder if hospitals themselves, these sort of modern, bastardizations of the womb,
that's a tragedy.
detrimental.
That is the tragedy
Do you
right there.
think there's a detrimental effect there?
Oh, that's a tragedy. That is the fact that we use hospitals for birth and death, and they have some of the worst electrosmog on the planet, is a tragedy of loss of soul for a whole gene pool. There's a bed at Machu Picchu, and if you use that for birth and death, man, you got a Stargate. So no, it's true. And all these pictures of the magnetic cloud that looks like the body leaving the body at the moment of death, you can see the ghost leaving the body at the moment of death, all those wonderful pictures. And there's lots of them. Guess what? Every single one of them is near a forest, and not one of them is in a hospital. Hello.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's makes me wonder, again, like, what can we do to reverse these things? Obviously, not having our children in hospitals are imperative to, spare our future generations of that tragedy. But, for myself, someone who was born in a hospital, would it be advantageous to go and put like an orgone puck in the ground at the, at the grounds of the hospital I was born, maybe in the back area or something?
You might get some leverage for the spot. I mean, well, first of all, orgone is a very good for breaking up geopathics, but useful for assembling magnetics. Useless for assembling magnetics because it's a fractionating device. So you can break up some geopathic, but you're never going to assemble anything interesting with orgone. But the other thing is the place where the magnetic memories of the family have leverage is probably not even usually the hospital, but there will be some place that was sacred to your ancestors, which you can probably research and find and catch the wind. I mean, you can even heal the trauma of your ancestors by actively navigating their lucid dreams. We have friends who are doing that, like when we found out the Mormons were killing the Utes and and then they denied it. So there's whole ancestor lineages that need to be healed. It's serious work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Peter Shampoo, I'll say his work in New England has really brought so much to my travels around the area. And I found out that his chakra ley line goes right through the area that I was born. And there's even a magnetic anomaly that I found on some map in the mouth of the Housatonic River, which is on the eastern shore of where I am from. So I'm curious, now where.
Yeah, and Peter's wonderful. He must be almost as old as me. That's shocking. He's been at it a long time, and that's wonderful. But he's close to Henry McLean there, my friend in Boston, and they track where that magnetic line from Europe actually comes in to the Boston area and where the whole array is fed from there. And it's wonderful work. And you're right. All kinds of tribal ancestral memories are tied up in those magnetic maps. That's the blood of ancestors for sure.
Mm. And it's interesting. I've noticed that these very large boulders that at least at one point were probably ceremonialized or cherished by native groups. They've been moved, they've been put in curious places. I actually just thinking, I always see these massive boulders in front of high schools, and there's sort of like a tradition where the senior class will spray paint that boulder, their class year or whatever, and it just sort of gets repainted every year. But I just thought to myself, I wonder if there was a thought there about putting a certain type of boulder in a place like a school. What can you say about that?
Yeah, no, you could anchor a magnetic line if the boulder was well paramagnetic and well placed. It could become a node in array that could be very useful. Dolmen, lots of beautiful books about how those dolmen were used for seed germination and anchors for memory points. Absolutely. I mean, the basic skill to start is to be able to make a magnetic map for yourself. Really, if you can't walk across a strong magnetic line and feel your hair stand up, that is step one. It's like Gurdjieff saying you can't do sacred gymnastic unless you can put feel in your baby finger. What he meant was, Bliss, boiling your blood is what makes you an antenna.
Right. Now, on the point of my local interests, you've brought up the Templars several times, and they have it's been claimed that they built the Newport Tower, which is just one state over. I've never visited, but I plan on visiting. What can we learn about the Templars from this Newport Tower? Do you have anything about the tower?
Actually, we think the Newport Tower was designed by John Dee to teach the physics of consumed perspective from the pinhole camera physics. We have a whole episode of fractalu.com. If you go to the older episode at fractalu.com, you'll see the lecture on the Newport Tower. But basically, when the light comes in that pinhole and makes perfect invert shadow, like the ancient pinhole camera on the opposite side, that design was John Dee, placed in a location where he basically invented longitudinal navigation of his day. No, that's quite a story. It wasn't just Templar.
Wow. So John Dee visited the New World, do you think?
No, but John Dee was the navigator for the Elizabethan fleet.
Right.
There was all that lecture is by there's one by Egan at fractalu.com. That's how the latitude and longitude got coded into the location of the Great Pyramid and the speed of light. It's an amazing story.
Yeah.
They were, because navigation was the way you ruled the world in those days. And the physics, if you read that book, Holy Grail Across the Atlantic, that was the beginning of when they could discover how to do longitude in addition to latitude. That was the beginning of leverage on the planet. So it was a very profound discovery. And that's what Templars were, basically, was psychonavigators. So they're the ones who found the Ark of the Covenant on the St. Michael's Island there in the Azores, because really, the Ark of the Covenant didn't work unless it was a magnetic line, because it had to charge in order to contain radioactives, basically. So this was all Templar stuff. Our articles on that also are at goldenmean.info/Buehler, Buehler, where he did all this work on Templar navigation.
Thank you. Yeah, and all those links will be in the description. So folks listening, at any point you want to pause, check that out, go back and look in the description. All of the links that Dan has mentioned will be there. But on the point of Templars, I've heard it sort of explained like the Templars built temples on the template, right? This sort of, we have this similar prefix in each word. And this template, this blueprint of energy is exactly what we've been discussing, this magnetic grid, this, sort of living nodal network that humans have, whether instinctively or knowingly, built their civilizations around. And once you start to notice once you pick up, the different cues and clues as to where, humans have sort of flourished, you can then go and discover, quote unquote, discover where the other places that humans could theoretically flourish. So this is why we're finding places like Florida have thousands of years of ancient history, because there's just something about Florida, whether it's the spring water or the coquina stone. And we can probably say the same thing about certain places that seem inhospitable, like Phoenix, right? I mean, Phoenix is a place where it's a complete desert, but people have lived there as far back as the Hohokam, thousands and thousands of years ago. So we have this, this group of people who have a keen sense of where to look and how, to sort of predict where a great civilization could be built. And I think we see that with a place like Phoenix, Arizona, and possibly even Los Angeles, which seems to have been built for seemingly no reason. It's not a good port compared to San Francisco or San Diego.
But it's a very good point you make about the Four Corners area. I think there's at least 2 or 3 very distinct Orion star maps in the U.S. Southwest Four Corners area. goldenmean.info/Orion has a bunch of those examples. But when Bernard of Clairvaux placed the Gothic cathedrals in a detailed star map of Virgo, just having woken up from a lucid dream in which he met a Black Madonna who told him, why did they need a star map of Virgo? Well, this is a fractal on the land, the same we have star map of Draco and Angkor Wat and Orion all over the planet. This was basically how you designed embedding for plasma projection for star inhabiting.
Right. Now, this Stargate of Orion, is this something that's built into the landscape, or is it built?
There's dozens of them around the planet. There's star maps of Orion, not just there. I think Larry Hunter found like 300 sites on the Giza Plateau that fit the star map of Orion. Some of that's at goldenmean.info/Orion, but there's 3 or 4 of them in the American Southwest. They're all over the planet. And you see, yes, Elena Danaan is right that the bad guys infest the galaxy's most powerful Stargate in the trapezium in Orion. But that doesn't mean the Stargate itself is illegal. That was the best doorway in and out of here, a small planet, long way from downtown. So that's why you got so many star maps of Orion and Draco and Angkor Wat and the Virgo and in the Gothic cathedrals. So the meaning of star map there is to get leverage when you wake up in a lucid dream. That's called array embedding. If Osiris, who's really inky, didn't inhabit the sun, he couldn't make the Nile flood on time. Oh my.
Right. And I ask because I recently found a fascinating book about Glastonbury in England, how these hills and roads in Glastonbury encode the zodiacal figures.
Very detailed zodiac. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, do we have this same thing going on with mounds and maybe even mountains or stones, or is it something that was built into like the planning and zoning of cities?
Well, the map of Prague is a rose, literally, but in the case of Glastonbury, there's a lot of evidence that the ancient Elohim Anunnaki is more UK than it is Israel, actually. And so there's a lot of truth in that. Even Lawrence Gardner says Britain means Beret On, birthplace of the Anunnaki. So wow. Trying to make and inhabit a star map that you could then inhabit stars was classical. If you're stuck on a small planet a long way from downtown, man, you need leverage.
Right. Wow. And you need leverage to pull off things like making it rain and steering tornadoes. And
exactly.
As we sort of come to the close of this incredible conversation, I really want to thank you, Dan, for sharing all of this with me. And clearly I have a lot to learn. I hope to invite you back onto the show in a few months to revisit some of these ideas. But my lovely girlfriend, Tara, who has been listening to a lot of your work lately, wanted me to ask you how rainbows are made.
Well, in Rene Dumal's famous Sufi book, Mount Analog, you will not even see the mountain you need to climb unless you have the light of the green flash. And we, 3 days in Perth in a row, we saw this green flash at sunset. The physics is atmospheric. Once you know that the reason color exists is phase conjugation, it's important until you know that. So fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis. There is the equation proof that the reason color exists is phase conjugation, literally. Then you can understand why when Tibetan saints die, it's proven rainbows are common. The reason is because they contribute to the centripetal charge compression that enables the atmosphere to be fractal, that enables charge distribution, enables the charge lines to converge. So pollution is the opposite of rainbows fundamentally, because there has to be a center inversion point. And that's what sorts, because remember, color is only a name for the tilt angle of the photon traveling as a torus. That's what it is. Green is 90 degrees, and the angles of the photon are actually platonic. It's all at the wavelength. So that enabling of the physics of rainbows is actually very indicative of the physics of immortality. That's why there's so many beautiful myths about rainbows, because the physics behind a rainbow, that phase conjugation is the only way they happen. So the electrical stability of the atmosphere at the moment of the green flash, that's when the wavelengths differentiate according to phase angle if the atmosphere is perfectly flat, because that is a phase conjugate four-wave mixing phenomena. Normally would only happen on a perfectly flat sea horizon at the moment of sunset.
That's incredible. Now, someone I've had on the show, he goes by the alias Crow 777. He's kind of famous for witnessing something that he called the lunar flare, or the lunar green wave. And I'm wondering if this sort of thing, this green flash, could happen on the moon, based on what you know about the moon. If you research the moon, I'm not sure, but I'm just sort of leveling this question to you because you seem to have a infinite knowledge, sir. I mean, geez, this is really informative, this conversation.
Well, I wouldn't say infinite. I mean, I have a prejudice against, the Andromedans originally said, whatever parasite stuck the moon in there, we'll tow it away. We'll do you a favor. Well, actually, it's hollow in metal and the opposite of conjugate. And therefore, you must avoid the moon if you want a seed to germinate. There's the physics. Because when the moon it's because in the sun and the earth, the longitudinal ray cannot project here because it's hollow and metal. And so that's why seeds won't grow. Hello. So the moon is, they stuck it here because we needed atmospheric stability after the Lesser Dryad flood when the Federation had to kick out the Nebu. It's a long story, but it is definitely hollow and metal and artificial and rings like a bell. So from an electrical viewpoint, not too helpful. However, our atmosphere would pretty much be toast without it for now, temporarily. But yes, you could use it for optical, refraction to a limited extent. Yes, and if the angle is on the moon, you could get some conjugation at the surface if you got the four-wave mixing working.
Interesting. Okay, and then infinite, I should have said multifaceted. Is maybe more. You'd accept that.
Yeah, well, don't call me late for dinner, but otherwise, I'm not worried.
Well, we hope to not make you late for dinner this evening. I do want to ask you about shamans and their ability to, let's say, control, for lack of a better term, the weather. Maybe it's more appropriately influence the weather, and how this connects to something like the practice of, transmutation and transformation. A lot of what I've learned about shamanic lore involves animal spirits and the ability to sort of visualize yourself in an animal's consciousness. Is this kind of the same thing that's going on when a shaman creates a rainbow or a rain cloud?
I've spent a lifetime studying this, so I got stories about that. Like the reason Tutankhamun was used by the pharaohs to control the flooding of the Nile after, a couple hundred generations, the yearning of ancestors, pharaohs got fired if they couldn't make rain. So yes, the kids would inherit the yearning. That's how Tutankhamun learned. But no, when Rolling Thunder did it, he knew which black beetle belly to tickle. Now, at the time, he didn't know that beetle, like the Egyptian scarab, had a nervous system which was profoundly fractal. Hello, there's a clue. So no, but I've used pine cones often for that. If you hold a pine cone correctly at the right angle and do a little, you can tickle a cloud. Actually, if you study the physics, Trevor Constable's Weather Engineering on the High Seas, the conic orgone capacitor, which was most effective in rain making, was a 60-degree cone. Hint, the angle of this cone, guess what? 60 degrees between the infinite stellation of Dodecaecos and Dodecus. So that tells you it is implosive capacitance. That's the fundamental principle. So precipitation, a child who puts a hole in the cloud is usually barefoot in the mud and happy. And then when they focus in that cloud, the hole occurs because centripetal charge is the physics of precipitation. It simply teaches the water vapor how to touch to form a droplet, sometimes called the power of Christos.
Oh, wow. And when you mentioned the pine cone, it made me think of over and over noticing these pine cone shaped pinnacles or finials on the top of buildings. I mean, over and over again, you see this. What do you think of that? Even in people's lawns, they have ornaments.
They can focus the microwave, but there's many meanings there. Remember, at Rennes-le-Château, the shape in which they made the gold powder wafer cake was pine cone shaped for a similar reason. Actually, that Seltz River, they use the mineral to make gold powder. Full service, City of the Dead. So pine. The most instructive physics there is Lawrence Edwards, fields of form, vortex of life, measuring from year to year. The tree would adjust the angle of the capacitors called seeds on the surface of the pine cone, opening and closing, to modulate the amount of wattage that tree was extracting from gravity.
Wow. That's incredible. Well, Dan, I want to thank you for this tremendous conversation. We've covered so much ground. And like I said, I hope to have you back on in a few months to maybe go into one of these topics in detail. But before we go, you've mentioned several websites. I hope to collect all of those and put them in the description. But is there one main place you'd like to direct listeners to? Anything that you're working on? Any books that you have to offer?
Yeah, I think there's 4 or 5 books now at the homepage, goldenmean.info, fractalfield.com. My state-of-the-art physics really is fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity. All the presentation, 2 million views, youtube.com/Dan Winter Fractal Field. So, we're becoming a shareable wave, and we're happy to play with you. Thank you. And thank you for asking the right questions. And thank you for being young enough to do something that's great. I think you've got twinkle in your eye. I'm happy to play with you.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. Yeah, I hope to be inspiring people. I know conversations like this one are the right charge to propel people out of the mundanity that maybe they're trapped in. It happened to me when I was just a delivery driver listening to a podcast. I'd hear a conversation like this one and be all charged up. And little did I know it was that implosive force I was generating that rocketed me out of that lifestyle into this new one. And
wow. You followed your bliss. Wonderful.
Yeah, that's what I hope to encourage everyone to do. Cool. And on that note, do you have a final thought you'd like to wrap up for people? Maybe a word of wisdom for people who want to follow their bliss. Some advice in that realm.
Well, yeah, I think it's important we not be discouraged with all of the messes that are happening on the planet to start thinking, oh, the bad guys are doing this and oh, the bad guys are doing that. Well, actually, if we each do our best to help each other follow our bliss, and we might start to pay attention to some wonderful things happening. Frankly, for me, lots of wonderful things are happening. So let's look at it that way.
I love it. I love it. That's the reason I don't watch the news. And here's more confirmation not to. So with that in mind, folks, immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now.
Blessings. Stay in touch. I really enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you. We're done recording, and I know you're still recording on your end. If you want to hit stop recording.